Now welcome to another lightning response video where this time I'm going to try to answer a bunch of questions. I always get a ton. I always feel bad that I don't answer more. So I'm going to try to rapid fire off as many as I can here. And we will kick it off with this one from Simon Dalberg, who asked, "Hey Thor, what's your thoughts on all the Jedi surviving Order 66? The Filoni movie would have been a good place for both Ezra and Ahsoka to sacrifice themselves, directly or not, for the greater good. It's a shame that Ahsoka already is in the post-OG trilogy timeline, as it has always been my understanding that Yoda and Obi-Wan were the only two living Jedi in existence. What's your thoughts on the last part there?" And I always see this one kind of debated or discussed, how many Jedi would have survived Order 66, how many would have survived into the original trilogy, and does that kind of ruin the original trilogy, considering Yoda does say to Luke, "The last of the Jedi will you be," and it's not quite as impactful or scary if we think that there are still plenty of Jedi out there who could, in theory, defeat Palpatine and Vader and save the galaxy, though I think in all reality, no matter what Yoda meant, if Luke is literally the last one or not, I think Luke is the only one who could have saved the galaxy or stopped Palpatine and Vader, so it could be interpreted to mean that. But I really do think it means that you are the last of the Jedi, that there are no others, and if there are, they're in hiding, they're kind of off the grid, they're not really thinking about how am I going to save the galaxy at this point, they're just trying to survive. But anyway, I do think plenty of Jedi would have initially survived Order 66. There were still thousands of them around, and when you consider not every Jedi was going to be in the vicinity of the clones when the order was given, that not all of them were in the temple to be slaughtered by Anakin immediately after, that sure, plenty were out there doing their own thing, doing something separate from the Clone Wars, probably heard what happened and weren't eager to go back and encounter the clones or anything like that. Especially when the beacon calling them home got turned off and they got the message from Obi-Wan. So yeah, I don't have much of a problem with a good number of Jedi surviving Order 66. It just gives Vader plenty of Jedi to hunt down and destroy, along with the Inquisitors, I suppose. But I do have more of an issue with so many of them potentially being around during the original trilogy, and maybe to some degree lessening not necessarily what Luke did, but the fact that, yeah, there were others still out there that could have been doing something and helping and saving the galaxy theoretically, but it doesn't diminish it that much one way or the other. Again, Luke was the only one who was going to stop Palpatine and Vader. Alright, let's move on to this one from Ty Twist, who asked, "Hey Thor, something that confused me a bit is, if the Jedi believed the Sith to be extinct, then why do they still have a prophecy about a chosen one who will destroy the Sith in order to balance the Force?" And I think this is because even if the Sith are extinct, as far as the Jedi know, it doesn't mean the dark side itself is extinct or destroyed. It will always rise again. It is always present. It is always kind of waiting in the wings for good to let its guard down. I've said before, that's kind of the lesson of the prequels, that you have to be vigilant even if you don't see an enemy, even if you don't see a threat, even if you don't see evil coming. You have to be ready for it. You always have to be on guard for it. And so even though the Jedi had not seen the Sith for 1,000 years, even though they thought they were extinct and were pretty surprised to see them return, I think the point of the prophecy in story, or what we're kind of supposed to take away from it, is that again, it's a reminder you always have to be on guard. The bad guys are always going to come back, and so you have to be ready to defeat them and bring balance once more. Alright, and moving on, we have a comment here now from Pedrazor, who asked, "Hey Thor, I think the problem is the same as I always mention. Disney assumes fans will come regardless of what the project is about, as long as it says Star Wars. And because of this, they want the content of Star Wars to appeal to other demographics. It's not made for fans." And what's kind of funny about this is if you go back to 1977, the year Star Wars came out, or A New Hope as we call it now, the reason why that movie was so successful, or one of the reasons why it was so successful, is because it had broad appeal. There was something about Star Wars itself that people just really gravitated towards. They really enjoyed it, and it became this massive thing because what Star Wars is in and of itself is already appealing to many people. And so it's kind of strange that when Disney took over, they did, I agree with you, they did decide, hey, we gotta have even broader appeal here. We gotta appeal to every single human being on planet Earth. And so there definitely was a concerted effort to try to bring in more female fans, which was, as my wife has talked about, she's a huge Star Wars fan. Long before Disney took over, she was a big Star Wars fan. And she kind of finds it a little insulting that there's this implication maybe underneath it all that you couldn't have loved Star Wars before if you were a woman or a minority or whatever because there wasn't enough of you in there. And I'm not saying we can't have more women and minorities in Star Wars. But my point is, it's kind of a strange thing to say now Star Wars is for everyone because we made it that way, even though Star Wars became the biggest franchise on Earth because a lot of people felt like it was always for them. Anyway, let's move on to this one from JMS Rex, who asked, Hey Thor, kind of going along with the topic of Ahsoka, do you think that fans are starting to turn on the Clone Wars show out of, I guess the best word is spite, to Dave Filoni? I've noticed recently that a lot more people seem to be just hating on the show when I remember that people used to be praising it left and right. I get that it isn't perfect and it contradicted the EU when it didn't need to a lot of the time, but I feel people are just hating on it for not being the EU when Lucas made it clear he never considered it canon anyway. But I don't know, I'm probably biased because I grew up with the Clone Wars. And first of all, there were quite a few people who back in the day, back when Clone Wars was going strong on Cartoon Network, that didn't like it and complained about how it contradicted the EU, and I think they had every right to be upset about that, even though, as you point out, Lucas has said that, yeah, there is my Star Wars, and then there is what everyone else does, and it's still canon in its own way, but it's not my Star Wars. But anyway, and going along with what I did talk about in yesterday's video, I do think there has been a sort of turn against Dave Filoni, not by everybody, but by enough people where it does start to feel like there is more criticism towards Ahsoka, which is what I talked about yesterday, and even about the Clone Wars, which really did feel like, especially for a time there, like it was the most celebrated thing in Star Wars. It felt like for a while there, everybody loved Clone Wars, that the people who didn't like it, it kind of faded away, or were just done complaining about it, or were being drowned out by all the praise. But now again, I think with, again, Filoni kind of maybe falling from grace a little bit, and with just the general state of Star Wars not being all that great, you're hearing more complaints about all of it, including Clone Wars. I mean, I loved Clone Wars. I also enjoyed the EU version of the Clone Wars. I enjoyed the Karen Traviss novels, which people also out there have problems with sometimes. But anyway, I do think it is more a general just disappointment in Star Wars, disappointment that maybe Filoni didn't deliver as he should have or needed to with Ahsoka, and it's just this general sense of people not being happy with Star Wars. Not so much that everybody suddenly hates the Clone Wars. There were people who didn't like it back in the day, and then there were people like you who grew up with it and love it, and people like me who enjoyed it and also enjoyed what the EU did. Okay, and now we move on to this one from Kaleahu, who asked, Hey Thor, in sci-fi and fantasy writing, it's often more important to feel right than to be right. I don't believe the Disney-era creatives purposely want to crap on the franchise. They just understand their Star Wars in different ways, and without any guiding voice to say otherwise, they create content that felt right to them, but ended up just feeling wrong to too many others. It all ends up canon anyway, and the problem gets harder to overcome. What Star Wars as a franchise really lacks at this point is a core that the fanbase agrees on. A problem I think Lucas himself started with the special editions, prequels, and multiple tiers of canon. My question is, are there still enough common threads among the fractured parts of the fanbase to agree on what is Star Wars? More than anything else, I think Disney needs to figure this out before fixing anything. And on the one hand, I think it's pretty incredible and awesome and amazing that Star Wars is this multi-generational thing, that it has endured almost 50 years at this point, and that fans have jumped on at many different points along that timeline. Some have been here since Star Wars in 1977. Others joined up during the prequels. Others still, like that last comment, they found the Clone Wars and that's how they became fans. And I'm sure there are people who have jumped on board because of the sequels here in the Disney era. And so you do have this inherent problem of, well, everybody has a slightly different take on what Star Wars is to them, or what it should be, or how it should look and how it should feel. But I do think, going back to your question finally, I do think there is a common thread, and that thread is the Jedi. I think if Disney and Lucasfilm really want to fix the franchise, they need to go back to their roots, they need to go back to the Jedi and just tell a really good story about the Jedi. And sure, maybe that's what the Rey movie will ultimately be, but of course the Rey movie has the problem of people thinking that is not Star Wars, that those movies were terrible, that she was first in, that sequels were terrible. Either way, I do think the Jedi are the key to saving Star Wars. I think they are the thing that everybody thinks of when they hear the word Star Wars. Everybody sees lightsabers, everybody sees Jedi and Darth Vader, And so a really good story about the battle of good versus evil with Sith or some other Darksider coming to power against the Jedi as they should be, as the heroic good guys many of us think of them as or want to see them as, not necessarily questioned and deconstructed all the time. I think that is their best way to bring everybody from all these different generations together. I don't think you put it in any time period. I think you either move it into the far future or maybe you go somewhere in the old Republic. But again, just a good, solid story about the Jedi, about good guys fighting evil is probably, hopefully, maybe what could kind of bring all the fans together and have them agreeing that, yes, that is good Star Wars. All right, and moving right along, we have a comment from It's Bourbon Knight who asked, Hey Thor, I hadn't really thought about if I consider Andor to be true Star Wars, and this video got me thinking about it. And whereas I won't say that the Andor style of Star Wars isn't right, as I do think there's a place for it, I will say if given the choice between an Andor or a Skeleton Crew future for the franchise, I would have to pick Skeleton Crew. The way I arrived at this conclusion was to ask myself, what is the best example of Star Wars? And to me, that is episodes 4, 5, and 6, though 1, 2, and 3 could be lumped in there as well. These are all films, and films were the only expression of Star Wars for the longest time until books and comics and eventually TV shows came about. So to me, the purest form of Star Wars is George Lucas created films. With that in mind, I asked myself if Andor, or the Andor series came out as a 2.5 hour movie, would they have represented or even have been accepted as Star Wars? And to me, I feel they would have been rejected with the vast majority of viewers, considering it is too hard of a left turn in feeling/vibe of the previous 6 films. Then I consider the same scenario with Skeleton Crew, and I feel they would have been accepted for the most part. The low amount of force using and lightsabers would have drawn some criticism, but the feel, pace, and themes would have matched the films much more than Andor, or much better than Andor. What are your thoughts? And as always, thanks for the amazing content. And this one really goes along with my response to the last question, where I said that, yeah, Disney really should think about trying to get back to the core, getting back to the foundation of Star Wars, that baseline that I think pretty much all fans can agree is Star Wars, which is Jedi and Sith and the Force and all that sort of thing. I do tend to agree with you that in a different world, if we had episodes 1 through 6 and then an Andor movie came out, a lot of people would have complained about that. Now, it probably still would have been a great movie, but I think a lot more people, even more so than did say Andor wasn't Star Wars, would have kind of been saying that or rejecting it. Not because, again, it was bad, but because it was just so different in tone and everything else when compared to the original movies by Lucas. In other words, I don't think Andor is necessarily something George Lucas would have ever made or put in Star Wars, which isn't me saying I don't think it belongs. I think it certainly does. I think Star Wars, again, this is kind of the conclusion I came to after Skeleton Crew and after Andor, where I'm like, wow, you could have 2 different things entirely, and both can feel like Star Wars in their own ways. But anyway, I really do feel like if you're Disney and Lucasfilm right now and you're looking at your franchise, you're looking at the numbers continuing to go down, and you're like, how do we fix this? What can we do to save our franchise? I think finding a way to get back to the core of Star Wars is your best and probably only answer, the only thing that would ever truly unite the fan base again, because I do think that is the one thing we can all agree upon. Even if you love Andor, like I do, even if you love Skeleton Crew, like I also do, even if you love The Acolyte or the sequel trilogy or whatever it might be, I think we can pretty much all agree a good, solid story about the Jedi as the good guys versus the Sith or other Darksiders as the bad guys is the heart of Star Wars. All right, one more question here, and it comes to us from Knuth Maestro, who asked, Hey Thor, so I know that the Acolyte has been talked to death at this point, but I honestly feel like there's one key question you haven't answered. Given the core concept of a pre-Phantom Menace show showcasing Darksiders, what would your pitch or structure for the show have been? And the funny thing is, I don't think The Acolyte was on the wrong track with its initial idea. I certainly think a show about a Jedi and their Padawan tracking down a killer or getting involved in some sort of other mystery, and then somewhere along the way they realize, wait a second, is this dark side usage we're seeing here? Is there a Darksider out there who is powerful in doing all these things and setting all these things up, and then maybe they don't, for whatever reason, or can't for whatever reason, report back to the Jedi Order, or they're right on the heels of this potential Sith, and they're trying to update the Council, but just not getting their message through, something along those lines, because I really don't think you want the Jedi at that time knowing that, oh, there is potentially a Sith returning and then not taking it seriously, which is kind of what the Acolyte did. But I'm all for the idea of a Jedi chasing after the Sith and then getting the Sith perspective as well, what they are doing to stay 2 steps ahead. Or maybe it's all one big plot or plan that they want this particular Jedi to chase them and it's going to somehow benefit them. So yeah, I think the initial idea of the Acolyte is fine, and what I would ultimately go with, and what I'm kind of going to do for my series in a manner of speaking, that the Jedi is on the trail of the Sith, and for whatever reason, again, can't get that information back to the Jedi Order, and in the end, they're probably killed by the Sith. That's the best way to avoid that information ever getting back to the Jedi Order, because again, I really don't think you want the Jedi at this time, 100 years before the prequels, knowing about the potential return of the dark side. That just makes their fall in the prequels worse. It kind of defeats what that was even all about, that the Jedi were blindsided by the dark side, that they had no idea that they could potentially be back, and the Acolyte just totally throws that out and is like, well, they should have seen 100 years ago that the clues were there, that they were possibly returning, and they just ignored it, and it makes everything so much worse. Alright, well, I think that is enough rambling for one video, so now it is your turn to take to the comments below and tell me what you thought about anything and everything I had to say here, or answer some of these questions yourself, or ask a question for a future lightning response video. You just start your comment off with "Hey Thor," you ask your question, I try to answer it in a future video, but whatever the case may be, leave those comments below. Let's talk some Star Wars, and until next time, thanks for watching.